The galaxy, in its infinite wisdom and finite patience, had long ago established a pecking order that made perfect sense to everyone except, apparently, humans. At the apex of this carefully structured food chain sat the Zephyrians, 8-foot-tall, razor-clawed, triple-hearted killing machines who had spent the last millennium convincing every other species that diplomacy was just another word for negotiating the terms of your surrender. Their empire stretched across 47 star systems, each one acquired through the simple expedient of showing up and asking politely if anyone had any objections to becoming a tributary state. Surprisingly few did, once they got a good look at Zephyrian politeness in action. The species had turned warfare into an art form, child-rearing into boot camp, and breathing into a competitive sport that somehow always ended with someone else not doing it anymore. Which made Commander Vex'thara's current predicament all the more ridiculous. The massive Zephyrian stood in the cramped confines of a crippled dreadnought's command center, watching sparks rain from overhead conduits like the galaxy's most depressing fireworks display. 3 hyperspace jumps from home, the ship's quantum core had decided to throw what her chief engineer colorfully described as a temper tantrum that would make a supernova jealous. Now they were limping through space on auxiliary power, leaking atmosphere, and broadcasting their location to every scavenger, pirate, and tax collector within a 50 light-year radius. But none of that mattered as much as the 3 small forms huddled in the corner of the bridge, watching their mother with a kind of intense focus that suggested they were mentally cataloging every decision for future reference. Crix, Zahn, and Thyra, her cubs, barely past their first molting, still soft enough around the edges to pass for almost cuddly if you squinted and had recently suffered severe head trauma. They were supposed to be on their trial of fangs, the sacred coming-of-age ritual where young Zephyrians proved their worth by surviving 3 rotations in the wild without any assistance. Instead, they were trapped on a dying ship with a mother who was rapidly running out of options that didn't involve explaining to the matriarchy why she'd let her cubs die in the cold vacuum of space. "Commander," her navigation officer announced with a kind of cheerful resignation that suggested he'd already made peace with whatever fresh hell was about to unfold, "we've got a Class M planet in the next system. Primitive civilization, barely out of their agricultural phase. The Universal Translator flags them as humans." Vex'thara's predatory instincts immediately classified humans somewhere between harmless herbivore and potential snack food. She'd heard of them. Of course, every species had heard of humans. They were the galaxy's favorite example of what happened when evolution got drunk and forgot to install proper survival instincts. A species so aggressively non-threatening that they'd somehow survived first contact with 17 different predator races by being too pathetic to bother eating. The fact that humans had managed to spread across dozens of worlds was generally attributed to the same cosmic joke that had given them opposable thumbs and delusions of relevance. Most civilized species treated human colonies the way one might treat a particularly persistent fungal infection, annoying, but ultimately harmless enough to ignore. "Set course for the human settlement," Vex'thara commanded, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had once convinced an entire planetary defense force to surrender by strongly worded letter. "We'll leave the cubs there temporarily while we effect repairs." Her cubs perked up at this, their young faces brightening with the prospect of finally getting some proper predator-prey interaction. After all, what better way to begin their trial of fangs than by terrorizing some helpless humans? If only they knew. Dr. Elena Vasquez was having what she generously termed one of those days when the Zephyrian shuttle touched down in the middle of her prize-winning tomato patch. The kind of day where the hydroponic systems had developed what appeared to be a gambling addiction, the atmospheric processes were singing opera in 3-part harmony, and now aliens were using her vegetables as a landing pad. She watched through her kitchen window as the shuttle's doors hissed open, revealing the kind of apex predator that typically featured in nightmares and military recruitment videos. Commander Vex'thara emerged with the fluid grace of something that had never met a problem it couldn't solve with judicious application of violence, followed by 3 smaller versions that looked like they were mentally calculating the quickest route to Elena's vital organs. Elena sighed, set down her coffee mug, the one with Galaxy's okayest human printed on the side, and stepped outside to greet her unexpected guests. She'd been a xenobotanist for 15 years, which meant she'd developed the kind of professional curiosity that could override basic survival instincts. It also meant she knew exactly what Zephyrians were capable of, which made her next decision either remarkably brave or spectacularly stupid. "Welcome to New Eden Colony," she said, managing to sound almost sincere despite the fact that her tomatoes now resembled abstract art. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. You look like you're having ship trouble." Vex'thara studied the human with a kind of intense focus typically reserved for prey evaluation or really challenging crossword puzzles. Elena was perhaps 5.5 feet tall, possessed of the kind of sturdy build that suggested she spent more time in the field than behind a desk, and showed absolutely no signs of the existential terror that most species displayed when confronted with Zephyrian royalty. This was either impressive or deeply concerning. "Our vessel requires emergency repairs," Vex'thara announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I must leave my cubs in your care temporarily. They are undergoing their trial of fangs, a sacred ritual that cannot be postponed." Elena looked at the 3 young Zephyrians, who were currently engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion about which of her garden gnomes would make the best skull trophy. Sacred ritual. Right. And this involves survival training, combat preparation, learning to hunt and kill efficiently. Vex'thara delivered this information with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. "They must prove their worth as predators." "Ah." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Well, we're pretty big on survival training here ourselves. Different approach, maybe, but same general idea. Sure, I can keep an eye on them." Vex'thara blinked, all 6 eyes, which created a rather unsettling strobe effect. In her experience, most species required significantly more convincing before agreeing to babysit apex predators. The fact that this human had agreed so readily suggested either remarkable courage or complete lack of understanding regarding what she'd just signed up for. Given humanity's reputation for the latter, Vex'thara decided not to question her good fortune. "They will require combat instruction," she warned. "Physical challenges. Proper preparation for their roles as hunters." Combat instruction, physical challenges, got it. Elena made a mental note to clear her schedule. "How long are we talking?" 3 rotations, possibly 4. "I will return as soon as repairs are complete." "No problem. We'll figure something out." And with that casual dismissal of what should have been a diplomatic incident of galactic proportions, Elena found herself the guardian of 3 young killing machines who looked at her the way gourmets might examine a particularly interesting appetizer. The first day established what would become a recurring theme. The cubs expected one thing, Elena provided something completely different, and everyone involved spent a considerable amount of time confused. Crix, the eldest at barely 12 standard years, had inherited his mother's predatory instincts and her complete confidence in their universal applicability. He approached Elena that first morning with the swagger of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't claw his way through. "Human," he announced, his young voice carrying an impressive amount of imperious authority, "we require combat training. Show us your weapons." Elena, who was currently elbow-deep in soil samples, looked up with the patient expression of someone who'd spent years explaining complex botanical concepts to undergraduate students. "Weapons? Well, I've got a pretty impressive collection of gardening tools. Does that count?" Zahn, the middle cub, perked up with interest. "Gardening tools can be weapons. Show us these tools of war, human." Elena led them to her shed, which did indeed contain an impressive array of implements that could theoretically be weaponized if one possessed sufficient creativity and a concerning lack of regard for safety regulations. The cubs examined her collection with the focused intensity of military strategists planning an invasion. "These are adequate," Thara declared, hefting a particularly vicious-looking pruning shear. The youngest of the 3, she'd compensated for her size by developing what could charitably be described as a creative approach to problem-solving. "Great. We can start with basic tool maintenance and safety protocols." The cubs exchanged glances. This wasn't quite what they'd had in mind. Elena spent the next several hours explaining proper tool care, safety procedures, and basic gardening techniques with a kind of methodical thoroughness that had made her a legend among graduate students and a nightmare among those who preferred their education in more digestible chunks. The cubs, who had been expecting combat drills and hunting practice, found themselves learning about soil pH levels and optimal growing conditions for root vegetables. It was, Crix decided privately, the most boring combat training in the history of the galaxy. But Elena wasn't finished. Now, she announced, leading them to a cleared section of ground. "We're going to learn about resource management and strategic planning." This sounded more promising. The cubs assembled with renewed enthusiasm, ready for whatever sophisticated military tactics this human might possess. Elena handed each of them a packet of seeds. "We're going to plant a garden." The cubs stared at their packets with the kind of bewilderment typically reserved for abstract mathematics or instructions for assembling furniture. This was not what they'd signed up for. "This is not combat training," Crix protested. "Isn't it?" Elena asked mildly. "You're fighting against soil conditions, weather patterns, pest infestations, and resource scarcity. You're planning strategies for optimal growth and maximum yield. You're learning to work with your environment instead of against it. Seems pretty combat-oriented to me." The cubs considered this. It wasn't entirely wrong, even if it wasn't entirely right either. Over the following days, Elena introduced them to what she chiefly termed practical survival skills. This turned out to include such thrilling activities as water purification, shelter construction using available materials, and food preservation techniques that didn't involve simply eating everything immediately. The cubs approached these lessons with the kind of grudging acceptance typically shown by teenagers forced to learn algebra. They were learning things, certainly, but these weren't the kinds of things young Zephyrians were supposed to learn. Where was the hunting? The stalking? The ritualized combat that would prepare them for their roles as apex predators? Instead, they found themselves building lean-to shelters, calculating water consumption rates, and learning to identify edible plants. Elena approached each lesson with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything else, explaining not just the how but the why behind each technique. "The key to survival," she explained while demonstrating proper fire-starting technique, "isn't being the strongest or the fastest. It's being adaptable. It's using what you have available and making it work for what you need." Zahn, who had been struggling with the flint and steel, finally managed to produce a small flame. His face lit up with genuine pride, which was quickly replaced by confusion. Why did he feel proud about something so basic? Any Zephyrian could generate flame with their natural electrical abilities. "Because," Elena said, apparently reading his expression, "you did it without relying on abilities you were born with. You learned a new skill using tools and technique. That's something you can teach to others, something you can adapt to different situations." It was a novel concept for young minds raised in a culture that prized natural ability above all else. By the end of the first week, the cubs had acquired a bewildering array of skills that seemed to have nothing to do with their expectations and everything to do with Elena's particular brand of practical education. They could purify water using improvised filters, construct basic shelters from local materials, and identify 17 different edible plants native to New Eden. They were also beginning to suspect that their human caretaker was considerably more complicated than she appeared. This suspicion was confirmed when the colony's emergency sirens began wailing at 0347 hours on the 8th day. Elena was out of bed and moving before the cubs had fully processed what the sound meant. She burst into their temporary quarters, the colony's guest house, which had been hastily converted from a storage facility, with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested this wasn't her first emergency. "Up and moving, kids. We've got a problem." The cubs tumbled out of their beds, still disoriented from sleep, but responding instinctively to the command authority in Elena's voice. Through the windows, they could see other colonists moving with the same purposeful efficiency, their earlier impression of a sleepy agricultural settlement rapidly dissolving. "Solar flare," Elena explained tersely, pulling on a heavy coat. "Big one. It's going to play hell with our electronics and probably trigger some seismic activity. We need to get to the emergency shelters." This was more like it. The cubs perked up, their predatory instincts finally engaging with something that resembled actual danger. They followed Elena outside, where the colony had transformed into a model of coordinated emergency response. Colonists moved with military precision, each person knowing exactly where they needed to be and what they needed to do. Equipment was being secured, essential systems were being powered down, and evacuation routes were being cleared with a kind of efficiency that spoke to extensive training and recent practice. Elena took point, leading the cubs and a handful of other civilians toward the reinforced shelters built into the hillside beyond the main settlement. As they moved, She maintained a steady stream of communication with other team leaders, coordinating the evacuation with a kind of tactical awareness that seemed oddly sophisticated for a botanist. Delta Team, report. Are the hydroponic bays secured? Affirmative, Elena. All systems are in standby mode. Roger that. Charlie Team, what's the status on the atmospheric processes? Locked down and running on emergency power. We're good for 48 hours minimum. The Cubs exchanged glances. This level of coordination didn't happen by accident. They reached the shelters just as the first electromagnetic pulse washed over the colony. Electronic systems flickered and died, emergency lighting kicked in, and the ground began to tremble with the first of what would be many seismic aftershocks. Inside the shelter, Elena transformed from cheerful botanist to something that resembled a field commander. She moved through the crowd of evacuees, checking on injuries, organizing supply distribution, and coordinating with team leaders via hardened communication systems that had somehow survived the EMP. "All right, people," she announced, her voice carrying easily through the crowded space. "We're looking at a minimum 12-hour wait before the initial effects subside. I want damage assessment teams ready to deploy as soon as we get the all clear. Priority goes to life support systems, then communications, then infrastructure." The Cubs watched in fascination as their gentle botanical instructor revealed what appeared to be a completely different personality underneath. This Elena moved with purpose, spoke with authority, and displayed the kind of strategic thinking that would have impressed their mother. "Crix," Elena called, catching the eldest Cub's attention. "You three, over here. I've got a job for you." The Cubs approached eagerly, finally expecting something resembling proper predator work. Elena handed them clipboards. "I need you to do a head count and inventory check. Make sure everyone made it to the shelters and that we have adequate supplies for an extended stay." It wasn't exactly the combat assignment they'd been hoping for, but the Cubs threw themselves into the task with enthusiasm. They moved through the shelter with systematic efficiency, checking names against lists and tallying supplies with the kind of attention to detail that Elena had been drilling into them for the past week. As they worked, they began to notice things. The way the colonists organized themselves wasn't random. There was a clear command structure, established protocols, and backup systems for everything. The farmers they'd been living among displayed the kind of professional competence that suggested backgrounds considerably more complex than agriculture. Dr. Martinez, who ran the colony's medical facility, moved through the injured with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd dealt with trauma under fire. Engineer Petrov coordinated technical teams with the kind of tactical precision that spoke to military training. Even Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who ran the colony school, displayed a comprehensive knowledge of emergency protocols that seemed oddly sophisticated for a rural educator. "Elena," Vex'thara asked during a brief break in their inventory duties, "what did you do before you became a botanist?" Elena looked up from the supply manifest she'd been reviewing, and for just a moment, the Cubs caught a glimpse of something that didn't quite match the cheerful agricultural scientist they'd come to know. "I was in the service," she said simply. "Did some engineering work. Nothing too exciting." It was, the Cubs were beginning to realize, a significant understatement. The emergency lasted 18 hours. During that time, Elena coordinated evacuation efforts, managed supply distribution, and organized damage assessment teams with a kind of systematic competence that suggested extensive experience with crisis management. The Cubs found themselves serving as runners, messengers, and general assistants, their natural physical abilities proving surprisingly useful for tasks that required speed and agility. By the time the all-clue sounded, they gained a completely different perspective on both their human caretaker and the colony itself. "So," Zahn said as they emerged from the shelters into the dawnlight, "Elena was a soldier." "Obviously," Crix replied. "Did you see how she handled the emergency coordination? That wasn't agricultural training." "Which means," Vex'thara added thoughtfully, "this whole colony might not be what it appears to be." Their suspicions were confirmed that afternoon when they accompanied Elena on a damage assessment tour of the settlement. What they found challenged every assumption they'd made about human capabilities and limitations. The colony's infrastructure had been designed with redundancy and resilience that went far beyond what would be necessary for a simple agricultural settlement. Power systems had multiple backup generators, communication networks, had hardened components rated for military use, and the buildings themselves showed evidence of construction techniques optimized for durability under extreme conditions. More telling were the colonists themselves. As Elena introduced them to various settlement leaders, the Cubs began to recognize the signs they'd been trained to identify in potential adversaries. These people moved with the controlled awareness of trained combatants, spoke with the measured precision of individuals accustomed to high-stakes decision-making, and displayed a level of tactical coordination that spoke to extensive experience working as a unit. "Elena," Dr. Martinez called out as they passed the medical facility, "I've got those ballistic trauma kits you requested. Want me to run a refresher course on combat field medicine while we're at it?" Elena glanced at the Cubs, who were listening with obvious interest. "Maybe later, Roberto. We're still working on basic first aid." The Cubs exchanged meaningful looks. Ballistic trauma kits were not typically associated with agricultural settlements. That evening, as they sat around Elena's kitchen table sharing a meal of vegetables from her miraculously undamaged garden, Crix decided to address the obvious. "You weren't just a soldier, were you?" Elena paused in the middle of cutting her tomatoes, considering her response. After a moment, she set down her knife and looked at each of the Cubs in turn. "No," she said simply. "I wasn't just a soldier." She was quiet for a long moment, then seemed to come to some internal decision. "I was a combat engineer with the Terran Federation's Rapid Response Division, specialized in battlefield logistics and emergency infrastructure. Did 3 tours in the Proxima conflict and 2 in the Vegas system uprising." The Cubs stared at her. The Proxima conflict had been a legendary engagement, one of those battles that military strategists still studied centuries later. The Rapid Response Division had been an elite unit, the kind of soldiers who got called in when situations had progressed beyond conventional solutions. "The colony," Vex'thara said slowly, "it's not really an agricultural settlement, is it?" Elena smiled, and for the first time since they'd met her, it was a kind of smile that carried a hint of danger. "Oh, it's definitely an agricultural settlement. We grow some of the best produce in the sector. But you're right, that's not all we are." She gestured toward the window, where the lights of the colony twinkled in the gathering darkness. New Eden was established as a retirement community for former military personnel, combat veterans, intelligence specialists, logistics coordinators, technical experts, people who spent their careers in high-stress situations and wanted somewhere quiet to decompress. "We chose agriculture because it's peaceful, productive, and doesn't require us to shoot at anyone." "But you maintained your military capabilities," Crix observed. "Hard to turn off 20 years of training," Elena admitted. "Plus, the galaxy can be a dangerous place. It seemed prudent to maintain a certain level of preparedness." The Cubs absorbed this information in silence. They'd spent the past 10 days learning from individuals they'd assumed were harmless civilians, only to discover that they'd been receiving instruction from some of the most dangerous combatants in human space. It was, they realized, a rather significant miscalculation. Over the following days, Elena began introducing them to other aspects of the colony that had previously remained hidden. The farmers they'd been living among revealed themselves to be former Special Forces operators, intelligence analysts, combat pilots, and technical specialists. The peaceful agricultural settlement they'd taken at face value turned out to be populated by individuals who'd spent their careers in some of the most dangerous occupations the galaxy had to offer. More importantly, Elena began incorporating elements of actual combat training into their daily routine, but not in the way the Cubs had expected. Instead of focusing on individual prowess or predatory instincts, Elena emphasized teamwork, tactical coordination, and strategic thinking. She taught them to analyze situations from multiple angles, to identify weaknesses in apparently strong positions, and to exploit advantages they might not have recognized. "Strength isn't everything," she explained during one memorable lesson that involved using basic engineering principles to move objects many times their own weight. "Intelligence, creativity, and teamwork can overcome raw power almost every time." The Cubs found themselves learning to think like strategists rather than simply relying on their natural predatory advantages. Elena introduced them to concepts like force multiplication, tactical flexibility, and operational planning that went far beyond anything they'd encountered in traditional Zephyrian education. Most importantly, She taught them to see potential allies where they'd previously seen only prey. The galaxy is full of species that look weak until you actually understand what they are capable of, Elena observed during one of their evening discussions. Humans learned a long time ago that cooperation gets you farther than domination. We may not be the strongest or the fastest, but we're very, very good at working together. It was a lesson that would prove more relevant than any of them anticipated. Commander Vex'thara returned to New Eden Colony after 22 standard days, her dreadnought limping through the system on freshly repaired engines. She expected to find her cubs traumatized, possibly injured, and almost certainly eager to return to proper Zephyrian civilization after their unfortunate exposure to human inadequacy. What she found instead challenged every assumption she'd ever made about predators, prey, and the fundamental nature of survival. The cubs met her shuttle at the landing pad, which, she noted with mild surprise, was no longer located in the middle of a vegetable garden. They moved with confident purpose, their bearing suggesting successful completion of challenges rather than the desperate relief of survivors. "Mother," Crick said formally, his voice carrying new notes of authority and self-assurance. "We request permission to demonstrate our acquired skills." Vex'thara studied her offspring with growing confusion. They looked healthy, well-fed, and oddly competent. This wasn't what she'd expected from cubs who'd spent 3 weeks with prey animals. "Demonstrate," she commanded. What followed was unlike any trial of fangs demonstration she'd ever witnessed. Instead of individual combat prowess or hunting displays, her cubs presented a coordinated tactical exercise that would have impressed military instructors. They'd identified weaknesses in the colony's defensive perimeter and developed comprehensive solutions that addressed everything from communication protocols to supply chain management. More impressive was their obvious comfort working with humans as tactical partners rather than potential prey. Elena and several other colonists participated in the demonstration. Their contributions integrated seamlessly with Zephyrian capabilities to create something more effective than either species could have managed independently. "Interesting," Vex'thara observed, her tone carefully neutral. "This is not traditional trial methodology." "No," Elena agreed, appearing at the commander's elbow with a casual confidence that had once seemed so bizarre and now appeared considerably more ominous. "But then, traditional methodology assumes certain limitations that may not actually exist." Vex'thara turned to study the human who'd been caring for her cubs. Elena met her gaze without flinching, and the Zephyrian commander found herself looking at someone who projected the same quiet competence she'd encountered in veteran combat officers. "You are not what you appeared to be," Vex'thara said. "Neither are you," Elena replied mildly. "I was wondering when you'd figure that out." Before Vex'thara could ask what she meant, alarms began sounding across the colony. Not the emergency sirens they'd heard during the solar flare, but something altogether more urgent and considerably more dangerous. "Proximity alerts," Elena said, checking a handheld device that definitely hadn't been designed for agricultural applications. "We've got incoming ships. 3 vessels. Configuration suggests raiders or pirates. ETA approximately 15 minutes. Vex'thara's predatory instincts immediately engaged. This was the kind of situation Zephyrians were designed for: direct confrontation with hostile forces, clear objectives, and the opportunity to demonstrate superior combat capabilities. "My dreadnought is not fully operational," she admitted grimly. "Weapon systems are offline for another 6 hours minimum." "Not a problem," Elena said with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she'd dealt with similar situations before. "We've got this." Vex'thara blinked, all 6 eyes, which created that strobe effect again. "You have this." Elena's smile carried the same hint of danger the cubs had learned to recognize. "Commander, you're about to discover why humans have such an interesting reputation in certain circles." The next hour provided Vex'thara with what could charitably be described as a comprehensive education in human military capabilities, and what would more accurately be termed a complete revision of her understanding of galactic power dynamics. New Eden Colony transformed with practiced efficiency from peaceful agricultural settlement to hardened military installation. Defensive systems that had been carefully disguised as farming equipment revealed their true nature. Communication arrays emerged from concealed positions, and the retired farmers Elena had been living among demonstrated why they'd survived careers in some of the galaxy's most dangerous occupations. The cubs, rather than being evacuated to safety, were integrated into the colony's defensive coordination as tactical assets. Elena had been training them not just in individual survival skills, but in the kind of collaborative strategy that allowed smaller forces to defeat larger ones through superior planning and execution. When the raiders arrived, they found themselves facing something they hadn't expected and weren't prepared for. Instead of a helpless agricultural target, they encountered coordinated resistance from individuals who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making bad tactical decisions extremely expensive for anyone stupid enough to attempt them. The engagement lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, 2 of the raider vessels had been captured intact. The third was limping away with significant damage and a comprehensive understanding of why attacking human colonies was generally considered a poor career choice, and Vex'thara was forced to confront the reality that her cubs had learned more about actual combat effectiveness in 3 weeks with humans than they might have in years of traditional Zephyrian training. So, Elena said afterward, as they surveyed the captured raider vessels and processed the prisoners, still think we're harmless prey animals. Vex'thara considered her response carefully. The humans had demonstrated tactical competence that equaled or exceeded Zephyrian military doctrine, strategic coordination that made the most of available resources, and the kind of collaborative effectiveness that her own species had never quite mastered. More importantly, they'd done it while treating her cubs as valued partners rather than potential threats. I believe, she said slowly, that galactic understanding of human capabilities may require some revision. Elena laughed, the same cheerful sound that had characterized her approach to everything from gardening to combat coordination. Most species figure that out eventually. The smart ones, anyway. As they prepared for Vex'thara's departure, the cubs found themselves facing a choice they hadn't anticipated. Their trial of fangs was technically complete. They demonstrated survival skills, tactical competence, and the ability to function effectively under pressure. By traditional standards, they'd passed. But they'd also discovered something their species had never quite grasped, the difference between being predators and being effective. We would like to extend our stay, Crix announced during their final family meeting. There are additional skills we believe would benefit our development. Vex'thara studied her cubs, noting the changes in their bearing, their confidence, and their approach to problem-solving. They'd acquired something during their time with humans that went beyond traditional Zephyrian education, a broader perspective on what strength actually meant. The matriarchy will expect a full report on your trial experiences, she warned. Then they'll get one, Thyra said with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested she was looking forward to the conversation. It should be an interesting discussion. Elena, who'd been listening to this exchange with obvious amusement, finally interjected. They are welcome to stay as long as they want. We've got plenty of room, and frankly, they've been more help than trouble. Which, considering what I've heard about Zephyrian teenagers, is something of an achievement. And so Commander Vex'thara found herself returning to Zephyrian space alone, carrying a report that would challenge fundamental assumptions about predators, prey, and the true nature of strength. Her cubs remained behind to continue their education in the care of beings their culture had always dismissed as harmless herbivores. The irony, she reflected as a dreadnought jumped to hyperspace, was that the humans had been right about cooperation being more effective than domination. They'd simply neglected to mention that their particular approach to cooperation involved the kind of tactical coordination that could turn agricultural settlements into military nightmares for anyone foolish enough to underestimate them. 6 months later, when the cubs finally returned home, they brought with them ideas that would revolutionize Zephyrian military doctrine and a profound appreciation for the difference between looking dangerous and actually being dangerous. The galaxy's apex predators had learned from beings they'd assumed were prey, and discovered that sometimes the most effective hunters were the ones nobody saw coming. Elena, meanwhile, continued tending her garden and occasionally accepting young visitors from species that had heard interesting stories about human educational methods. Her tomatoes, she was pleased to note, had never looked better. After all, there was something to be said for fertilizer that came pre-equipped with valuable life lessons.